let's talk about the big problem with covenants. Back in Legion, all 12 of the classes in the game had their own order halls, which all provided their own unique stories and experiences, which ultimately provided the same rewards to everyone, besides the artifact weapon itself being different for every single spec. However, the artifact weapon itself was not optional. If you played a retribution paladin, you were getting the ashbringer and there was no choice to be made. In this system, the order halls and artifacts were basically default class features that you had no choice in and were just pure additions on top of normal gameplay. The Covenant system is pretty similar, except you actually have choices to make. There's 4 to choose from instead of 12, and you also get to pick the perks you want in addition to picking which story or aesthetic you like the most. Or, that's what most people kind of wish was the case. Herein lies the big problem with the Covenants. The idea of picking which of the 4 you like is based on a whole bunch of factors, of aesthetics, cosmetic items you want to obtain, and what kind of player power you want. With the Order Hall campaigns, you didn't really have a choice in the matter with anything, and some of the Order Halls definitely had way better stories than the other, and some of the artifact abilities were just straight up broken compared to some of the others, which were easily forgettable. For my Disc Priest, I lucked out and got an excellent artifact ability, although the Order Hall campaign kinda sucked. The Priest campaign was one of the weakest of all of them. It definitely wasn't as strong as the Rogue or Death Knight Order Hall campaigns, which were some of the best. And Shadowlands itself is almost an extension of the Death Knight Order Hall campaign. They really lucked out in both of those expansions. However, let's go over the player power. Each of the 12 classes has 4 different abilities they can pick depending on which covenant they choose, which means there is a grand total of 48 brand new abilities added to the game, a near similar number to the amount of abilities added with artifact abilities. Plus there's the 4 covenant specific universal abilities, like the Venthyr Teleport or the Nightfae Soul Shape. And with a massive amount of new abilities added to the game, it's pretty reasonable that they're not all equally balanced between each other. Hell, the talent rows are rarely balanced between each other. Although changing frequently between them based on what kind of content you're doing is kind of the point of how different the talents are, which is kind of weird that you're locked into picking a single talent when picking a covenant. When you pick one of the 4 covenants, in addition to the universal ability you also get one specific ability that is shared between all of your specs. And then you're locked into that one ability unless you go through the long process that is changing covenants. It's such a chore to change covenants that you might do it once or twice a patch, if at all, rather than maybe changing your talents a couple of times a day, depending what kind of content you're doing. So they really want to incentivize never changing your covenant ability. But just like talents, the usefulness in certain types of content varies greatly. For my Priest, for example, during the first patch of the game, the best covenant to pick for disc rating was easily the Venthyr Mind Games ability, which is simply a big single target nuke that also prevents a little bit of damage. It combos incredibly well with Spirit Shell and fits so well into the Priest rotation that the class feels like it's missing something if it doesn't have it for rating. However, it's not the best ability in all types of content. If I were to do high-end Mythic Plus dungeons and an organized group, then you're better off with the Nightfae ability because it allows you to lower the cooldown of your Fire Mage's Combust ability. If I wanted to solo stuff in Torghast, then I would definitely want the Curian ability to actually gain some decent AoE damage. And if I want to go Holy Priest and have some extra heals, then I'd probably want to go Necrolord for their AoE heal ability, because the other 3 types don't really mesh well with Holy's playstyle. However, constantly swapping between the 4 abilities isn't really possible, so I had to pick whichever one was best suited to the type of content I cared about the most, which was raid content. So I picked Venthyr for Mind Games. However, it was a little bit too good, and after some balanced tunings and this newest patch, it's no longer the best pick, so I might have to change my covenant. Now, I'm no Mythic Raider. Technically, I can just pick any covenant I want and I'll be fine. But the Venthyr ability was just so much better than everything else at the start of Shadowlands that it just felt silly to pick anything else. It could just be part of my min-max culture from playing World of Warcraft. Kind of a tangent, but I used to run a lot of one-shot D&D games for my Discord, which is a mix of World of Warcraft and Yu-Gi-Oh players, and I can always tell which ones came from the World of Warcraft side of my community based on how much they would min-max their characters in D&D. I don't go absolutely hardcore into min-maxing, but I want to be effective in the type of content that I like the most. And if I were to pick the covenant based purely on aesthetic, I would have 100% went Nightfae. Ori and the Blind Forest is one of my favorite games of all time, and Ardenwald looks like it takes heavy inspiration from Ori and the Blind Forest, as well as having similar elements to the Feywild from D&D, which I also quite enjoy. In fact, I was 100% ready to just pick Nightfae when Shadowlands launched, until I played with the ability long enough while leveling through the zone that I was thoroughly convinced it wasn't for me. I just straight up don't like the ability at all. And while I do understand it's good for certain types of gameplay, I don't participate in those types of gameplay, and I also just really don't like the ability besides that. I do like the Mind Games ability quite a bit though, so I begrudgingly went Vent there because it had the ability I wanted to use for my class. And that's one of the biggest problems with Covenants. Like, none of the other arguments even come close. Picking my Covenant of choice came down to a gameplay reason, and I really wish it hadn't. The thing is, I would have been fine if the Night Fae ability was just decent. I would have taken the slight loss of healing or whatever to play my Covenant of choice, but it was so much worse for my type of content that it felt like I'd be missing out just to have a button I would begrudgingly push occasionally. Mind Games is like fresh pizza that you just ordered. The Night Fae ability is like the soggy leftover pizza you forgot was in your fridge for a week. It's probably still good, it might technically nourish you, but one is definitely better than the other. Although it's not just having to pick a choice between gameplay and aesthetics. There is also the whole Soulbinds system. Now, the system itself is fine. It's basically like an extra talent tree, and a lot of the abilities are kind of worse than what you would get from a talent, so it's not as impactful for classes as the actual ability of the Covenant itself. But that's not true for all classes. There are some classes who will pick a Covenant specifically for its Soulbind tree, because they really want one of those exclusive traits. I'm not sure how common that is in comparison to picking the actual ability of the Covenant, but it's definitely a thing. If anything, I think the Soulbinds are just a fun little extra feature that does directly relate to the power level of your class, but not in such a major way that it's influencing your decision that much from which Covenant you want. There is one part of the whole system that's a little bit of a head scratcher, and that's the whole system of Conduit energy. Hello, I'm going out into the WoW community in order to ask people how they feel about Conduit energy. You there, citizen, what do you think of Conduit energy? What do I think about garbage? No, Conduit energy, you must have misheard me. Oh, that's worse. You see, part of the Soulbind tree is a series of traits you can pick up from the game called conduits. They're different for every class, and they're actually customized to fit different specs. So basically, you get to choose which of these conduits you want to improve your class with, and some of these conduits are incredibly good, others incredibly mediocre, but they do impact the power level of your class. And they have an item level associated to it, which means you have to go into the world in order to get stronger versions of them. The conduits are the same no matter which covenant you pick, which I think is a really good thing. However, because the system has a gearing component to it, Blizzard heavily restricts how often you can change them out. Every time you want to change one out, it takes up one of your conduit energy slots, of which you recover one of them every 12 hours or so. And this is to prevent players from changing them out too often. And the reason conduits do have a cooldown in place is because of the item level associated to them. If you luck out and get a high item level conduit for an ability you actually use, then it will feel good to always have that in place. Although if you have to constantly change them out to one of your lesser ones, because say you want to run a Mythic Plus dungeon or PvP, then you have to pay a price, which incentivizes you to just pick your highest item level one and stick with it, or whatever one is just your best. Or I guess that's the idea behind it. Honestly, the whole system seems kind of unnecessary. Changing out your talents is a breeze, and arguably impacts your power level more than changing out a conduit. However, you don't have to grind resources to obtain your talents, you just have them baseline. So being able to change around your baseline abilities whenever you want, or in a rested area, is okay, but once it comes to item levels attached to it, then I guess it becomes something that needs restricting. It could also be like the Master Loot change, where the system is limited so you can't change it up for every new boss pull. That way you're not told by your raid to go back to your covenant to change it all the time. You have the excuse that you can't change it because you're out of conduit energy. So basically, using a system in order to solve a social problem. However, you can already change out talents, which are just as impactful, if not more so, and during the raid, so why not just let them change conduits in the exact same way? This makes me think Blizzard just really doesn't like you changing your talents that way either, which they have talked about a couple of times in interviews, and they probably wish they could restrict them in the same way they do conduits. So it's probably not a good parallel to draw. Blizzard really wants you to make a meaningful choice and stick with it, which gives those choices more value. The only problem is it's so similar to another feature we can change out easily that it just kind of stands out as unnecessary. However, I should also note, conduit energy, while feeling like a completely unnecessary system that restricts you for reasons you might not agree with, is incredibly minor and doesn't affect more than 90% of players. I don't think I've ran out of conduit energy, even though it has that really dumb system where it consumes an energy when you first unlock a slot. The conduits are usually so polarizing to which one is better than the other that there's no point in changing them half the time for my class. If they didn't have conduit energy, I don't think I would have changed my conduits out any more than I already do. So the system of conduit energy is nowhere near on the same level of importance as attaching the Covenant ability to an aesthetic choice. If we were to rate them on a scale of 1 to 10, Covenant abilities being tied to an aesthetic choice is like an 8 out of 10 when it comes to problems with the Covenants. Probably the biggest problem. Conduit energy would be lucky to be a 3 out of 10. It's so incredibly minor that it's almost not worth talking about, but it is a head scratcher of a restriction nonetheless. Now, some good things about Covenant. If you pick the Covenant you like, then there's lots to do within the Covenant itself that makes them miles better than anything the Order Halls were. Mainly because of all the custom upgrades you can add to it, which give you teleports, a special minigame, and then of course all the special cosmetics that are tied to the Covenant. And some of those minigames associated to them are pretty legit. I think Kyrian and Necrolords definitely have some of the best. The Kyrian basically get a Brawler's Guild light. Necrolords get an awesome companion they get to customize and helps them in the open world content. The tea parties you can throw at the event there are actually not half bad. It's a neat little system that I wish was open to everyone. And the Queen's Conservatory with Night Fae is just a more hardcore version of the Half-Heal Farm. And a lot of the cosmetics you can unlock, which are tied exclusively to the Covenants, are pretty good. The only problem is they cost a ton of Anima. And it also costs a ton of Anima to unlock all of your buildings. I've been playing pretty much every day since the start of Shadowlands, and I still don't have all of my buildings maxed out. The Anima grind for the cosmetics is tough, but gives the players who like playing the game purely for cosmetics something hardcore to do in order to flex on everyone else who can't play anywhere near as much. So the cosmetic side of the Covenant seems to be pretty decent. Biggest problem I have is probably just how expensive everything is, as there's not really anything to spend your Anima on outside of Covenant cosmetics or upgrades. So if it was purely a cosmetic choice, I think more people would pick whatever Covenant they actually wanted to be in, rather than whichever one gave them the best power-ups. Although I'm sure a lot of casual players do pick the Covenant based on cosmetics alone, or because there was an ability they thought was just neat, even if it wasn't the BIS choice. So enough about going over all the problems with Covenants. What could be done to fix them? Over on my Yu-Gi-Oh channel, I have this segment where I talk about specific cards that are too broken to be played in the game, of just what could be done to fix those cards without completely changing the essence of what they're about. So, under that guise, here's my thought experiments on what could be done to help alleviate some of the Covenant problems. Number 1, the Covenant class-specific abilities themselves. I'm fine with the utility Covenant abilities being locked to Covenants. I don't really care if I have the teleport or any other 3 things. Those can stay locked to a Covenant. However, the actual class abilities themselves. Blizzard really wants people to make a meaningful choice when it comes to the abilities. But the problem is that they're tied to a cosmetic choice as well. So, I would suggest allowing players to make 2 choices. One choice for which Covenant you like to hang out in, and a second choice for which Covenant ability you actually want to use. During the storyline, when questing through all the zones, your character gets to know all the people and try all the Covenant abilities anyway. So, being able to just go back and ask to borrow their power, while hanging out in your Covenant of choice, seems like it would fit in the lore pretty well. It fits in with the theme of Blizzard wanting you to make a meaningful choice. And in this thought experiment, we still make changing your Covenant ability just as difficult as changing the Covenant itself. But at least you don't have to tie player power to the aesthetic choice. And hell, change over the Soulbinds too, because it's not like you actually see the people who are associated to the Soulbinds anyway. Option number 2, same as the previous suggestions, except instead of making 2 choices, you're given all of the Covenant abilities in a glyph panel window that you can just change whenever you want. Or I guess like how the Essence system used to work. Or even just an extra talent row, which has 4 abilities you can swap between in the same way you would swap talents. This version completely removes the choice from the ability, and just lets you pick whatever you want. This would also fit in with the lore, since again, you got to try out all the abilities when you're leveling through the zones anyway, and Blizzard has hand-waved more egregious stuff than this when it comes to lore and plot contrivances. This is the version that I'm sure a lot of people are asking for when they decry the Covenant system. I'm all for this change as well, mainly because it would allow me to play Night Fae without having to take the garbage Night Fae ability. Also, I'm a sucker for constantly changing things out. Whenever I play Yu-Gi-Oh, I never stick to a single deck. In fact, if playing any of the Yu-Gi-Oh games forced me to stick to a single deck, I probably would have quit the game a long time ago. Anyways, those are the 2 suggestions I have for the biggest problem with Covenants. So, what about Conduit energy? Well, in my thought experiment for how to fix Conduit energy, I'd probably just remove it, or instead just tie it to some kind of tome. like what you need in order to change talents outside of a rested area. Similar to how the glyph system used to work. In order to remove a glyph, you needed an item in order to take it out so that you could apply another. That way you're disincentivized from changing them out all the time, but you can at a price. Alternatively, just remove it and change nothing else. But Blizzard really wants to add restrictions to it, and these thought experiments are about trying to fit into the theme of what Blizzard is trying to do. Lastly, the cosmetics. They cost too much Anima, and the buildings themselves also cost too much Anima to fully unlock, and you're incentivized to unlocking the buildings first because they're just so much more useful. A way to fix this would be to just lower the cost of everything. But that's a little bit too simple. Instead, what they could do is just increase the ways you gain Anima as a reward, as currently it's incredibly limited in where you can actually get Anima from. One of the reasons it takes so long to unlock everything is because it doesn't drop like candy like previous similar systems did. Granted, it's meant to be purely cosmetic only, but it's too much of a grind. And Blizzard has already added one way to gain more Anima in their 0.5 patch. They know that Anima acquisition is too slow, and they're slowly working on ways of giving you more. Alternatively, they could split the resource into something else. That way Anima is only used on buildings and mission tables, and you have a different resource that allows you to buy the cosmetics. I'm sure a lot of people don't like the idea of having yet another currency to farm, but World of Warcraft already has 1 million currencies, so what's one more? And one other thing that I saw in a video from another YouTube creator that could possibly be added, that once you unlock everything, the actual cosmetics you can buy are pretty sparse. They need to add some kind of vendor that has just way more things available to buy with Anima that are also purely cosmetic. Okay, and that's everything with the problems of covenants, as well as theoretical solutions on how to fix some of those problems. Part of the reason this video was made was just because of how much I hate the Night Fae ability. But also, if you have any ideas and suggestions on how you would fix the problem with the covenants, I'll be reading the comments in this video below.